Back to another lecture. This is number 42, and today we're talking about military conflict in the Civil War. The theme is America in the world. And the first learning objective is explain the various factors that contributed to the Union victory in the Civil War. So first, we're going to talk about how both the Union and the Confederacy mobilized their economies and societies to wage the war, even while facing considerable home front opposition. Both governments devote all of their resources and all of their efforts to fighting the war. Now, the Northern economy had more advantages. The Union controlled all financial industries. 85% of the factories were in the North, 70% of railroads were in the North, and they had 65% of the farmland. So that means that they could produce more food, send it out to all the different parts of the country, and maintain this war effort longer than the South could. The railroads were going to be key, especially as the armies get larger and need to be transported to remote areas for the battlefields. You can see on the map on the right side that the Southern railroads, the Southern Railroad lines were a lot more spread out. There weren't as many of them. The Confederacy was hoping for outside financial help, and they overprinted paper money, which led to huge inflation, which hurt their economy. And they were hoping to leverage their cotton exports to get help from foreign powers like Great Britain. The North had all of the pieces to create an industrial war machine, but the South did not. There were some societal differences. The North had greater manpower at their disposal. They had almost 4 times the amount of free population in the North than they did in the South. It was about 5.5 million in the South and over 20 million in the North. And they already had an army. They already had a navy. They just had to continue to add to it. The Union had a strong central government. That's what had been built for the past 70 years. And the Confederate States of America had just been formed, and they deliberately created a weak central government, very much like the Articles of Confederation were in the 1780s. So that's going to make it really hard for them to fight a war. There was home front opposition within both sides. The southern states, they start to resist the strong government actions. The vice president of the Confederacy at one point even suggested that his home state of Georgia should secede from the Union, or from the Confederacy, which itself was a government formed out of seceded states. As the economy got worse in the capital city of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia, there were bread riots that showed discontent over the economy. Jefferson Davis actually had to confront a group of angry women who were looking for food to feed their families and told them to go back home, otherwise Confederate forces would fire upon them. In the North, there was also discontent. In states like Maryland, the president imposed martial law to keep the border states as part of the Union, and also in states like New York and the city of New York City, there were draft riots. Once the Union needed more manpower to continue to replenish its troops, the Congress passed a conscription law, and in New York City, laborers who were most likely to be drafted were angry, and they started to riot, and they directed their violence and their ire against African Americans in the city. All right, so although the Confederacy showed military initiative and daring early in the war, the Union ultimately succeeded. So the early parts of the war looked very hopeful for the Confederacy. We talked about how the Battle of Fort Sumter was an initial Confederate victory. And following that, we have the Battle of Bull Run, which is in Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C., and the Northern troops are defeated. It showed their inexperience. It was quite chaotic, the fighting, and eventually the Union troops retreated back to Washington, D.C. The Union general, George McClellan, attempts a innovative military maneuver that the United States had used in Mexico. It was an amphibious attack in which he would put all of his troops on boats and sail them to where he needed to sail them to, and then march and attack from a new point, from a new location. This is what they did in the Mexican-American War when Winfield Scott got American troops to get on boats, land at Veracruz, and then march to Mexico City instead of marching all the way across all of central Mexico. In this case, George McClellan is leaving the Chesapeake area and just going a couple miles south and landing outside of Richmond, trying to march into Richmond from the coast. And it fails miserably because his troop movements are too slow and the Confederate troops have enough time to mount a defense. And after this failed attempt, George McClellan is fired. He is relieved of his commanding duties by Abraham Lincoln. Following the Peninsula Campaign, there was a second Battle of Bull Run. The general that replaced George McClellan, John Pope, also loses this battle, and therefore he is fired. It's not until Antietam that the Union gets some semblance of a victory. At this point, George McClellan gets his job back. He looks into finding information about the Confederates' location, the Confederate troops' location, where they're going to be, and decides to mount an attack. And it's the bloodiest single day of the war. And so as the Confederate commander, General Robert E. Lee, starts his retreat, General McClellan does not pursue him, citing insufficient forces and not wanting to stretch out his forces too thinly. And Abraham Lincoln, when he finds out, is not going to like it, so he's going to fire General McClellan for a second time, and then finally ending his military career at that point. But Antietam is going to be important because, as we'll see, it's what President Lincoln will use as his platform for issuing out the Emancipation Proclamation. All right, so the attempts at gaining British recognition were promising at first for the Confederacy. The Trent Affair refers to an incident in which two Confederate diplomats were on their way to Great Britain to seek diplomatic recognition, and Union Navy ships intercepted the Trent, which was a British ship, and took the two Confederate diplomats off of the ship and imprisoned them. Great Britain was really angry about this because it was seen as an offense on the sovereignty and the neutrality rights of Great Britain. And after they raised a fuss, Abraham Lincoln released the diplomats back again. The Confederacy continued to purchase British warships and commercial raiders that were trying to get through the Union blockade of the southern coasts. And it really strained the relationship between the United States and Great Britain because Great Britain was flirting with the idea of helping the Confederacy early on in the war. So as we mentioned, the Confederacy had to start from scratch in terms of building its army and its navy. And one of the ways in which it built up its navy is by using old United States ships that were in the South at the time of secession. One such case was the USS Merrimack. That was a United States ship, and then it was repurposed into the CSS Virginia. They outfitted it with iron sidings, and it made it into an ironclad. And as soon as it was operational, it began to compromise the Union blockade because it was just a stronger ship because it had been reinforced. The U.S. Navy sent reinforcements in the form of the USS Monitor, and so this naval fight between the Monitor and the Merrimack, or the CSS Virginia, at Hampton Roads, Virginia, is seen as the highlight of the naval warfare between the two sides. It was it ended up being a stalemate, but it shows that there was going to be a new age in naval warfare and naval technology to be used in the future. Britain would eventually find other sources for cotton, and so they would refrain from helping the pro-slavery Confederacy. And so now we're going to talk about how the Union is ultimately going to succeed due to improvements in leadership and strategy, the key victories, greater resources, and the wartime destruction of the South's infrastructure. So the main strategy of the war, which was developed by General Winfield Scott, was the Anaconda Plan. It was to, at first, blockade the entire southern coast and then start squeezing the Confederacy by dividing it at different points. First, the U.S. Army needed to control the Mississippi to take away Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas as places where the Confederacy could get supplies. And then once that was controlled, then split it further, divided in half, as we'll see that they do that in Georgia. So McClellan is replaced by Ambrose Burnside, and after the Battle of Fredericksburg, Burnside is replaced himself because it is a Confederate victory and there is a lot of Union casualties. Meanwhile, General Ulysses Grant is gaining prominence in the Western theater of the war. He helps to capture Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, the city of Vicksburg in Mississippi, which solidifies the Union control of the Western theater of war and the control of the Mississippi River. And at the same time that Ulysses Grant was getting Vicksburg, the Battle of Gettysburg was going on. And it was the last attempt at the Confederacy of making a northern offensive. The Confederacy thought that if they had a victory in Northern Territory, that would be enough to get Great Britain to recognize that the Confederacy was a viable ally, that they had enough power to get independence, and so therefore worthy of getting the help of the British. So the Gettysburg battle was a Union victory. And you see the battle schematics for both of those major and important battles. So Vicksburg is on top. That was the siege of the city. They were cutting off all supplies, and they were just waiting for them to surrender. And then on the bottom right, you see the Battle of Gettysburg that was led by General Meade on the Union side. He leads a successful defense of that Confederate offensive. So after the siege at Vicksburg and the Battle of Gettysburg, Grant is given command of the Army of the Potomac. That is the main Union force in the eastern United States, and he is given the task to pursue and defeat General Lee. In the West, he leaves General William Sherman in charge of the Western campaigns. He starts in Atlanta and is supposed to march to the sea through the entire state of Georgia, and he leads a scorched earth campaign, which means that everything that they march through is going to be destroyed. They're going to destroy all of the southern infrastructure, especially the railroad. So you see on the top right side, there's a picture of Sherman's men taking out the railroad tracks, and then they would burn them and bend the metal so that it would be unusable. This is going to be really key for the reconstruction of the South afterwards, because all of the infrastructure is going to have to be rebuilt. In Richmond, Virginia, on April 3rd, 1865, the capital city of Richmond is captured. General Lee ends up retreating, and finally Grant catches him at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia on April 9th. When they finally meet at this meeting for surrender, all of the Confederate generals are wearing their very best uniforms because they had to throw out all of their clothes to travel as light as they could. And so they ended up changing into their cleanest and nicest uniforms. Meanwhile, the Union Army, which had been working double time to catch up to them, they were looking pretty raggedy themselves. But you see Grant and Lee there shaking hands, negotiating the final surrender. Grant tells Lee to send all of his men home, leave the weapons, but they could take their horses. All right, and so now we've come to the end of the Civil War. We will touch up on a couple more things that happened in the Civil War, but that was all of the fighting. So here's the recap. The Union and the Confederacy mobilized as quickly as they could to fight the war. Often they silenced dissent within their home fronts. The Confederacy showed early signs of success due to the poor strategy and fighting from the Union troops early on. Naval warfare begins to be transformed during the Civil War. We saw that with the Merrimack and the Monitor. The Union starts to place effective generals in charge. That's General Grant and General Sherman. They repel Confederate offensive at Gettysburg. That was General Meade, and that finally turns the tide of the war. Gettysburg was that turning point for the Union. Sherman's march to the sea compromised the Confederacy's ability to continue fighting, and then finally in April of 1865, General Robert E. Lee will surrender to General Ulysses S. Grant. All right, so that was it for this lecture. Thank you for watching. I'll hope to see you back for lecture number 43.